In 2003, in the town of Wasilla, Alaska, sisters Ellie and Sadie Grant, aged 8 and 6, were playing catch in the backyard of their small wooden house on Maple Drive neighborhood. 20 minutes later, the yard was empty. No screams, no footprints, no cars driving down the mud-covered road. Police were called, finding the red ball lying tilted beneath the fence, next to children's footprints that stopped abruptly. The search lasted for weeks, across forests, ditches, and snowfields. No bodies, no clues. The press called it the Alaska Heartland disappearance. The community held prayer vigils, posted photos of the 2 children on utility poles, and believed a stranger had abducted them. The girl's mother, Dana Grant, was advised to leave town to move on. Neighbors continued to stop by daily, bringing comforting food, including the Norwood family, who lived right next door, the only house where the windows were always closed, with a faint smell of deodorizer drifting out from inside. Then came the following spring. The snow melted, and a strange call was placed to the police. The mother in that very house reported a strange foul odor in her son's room. When Lieutenant Aaron Kessler stepped across the threshold, he realized the smell was not from a sewer, nor from mold. It was the smell of time and guilt, hidden beneath a layer of cheap deodorizer. And beneath the waterbed in that locked room, the truth began to emerge from Alaska's cold ice. Before we delve into this shocking true story, let us know where you are watching from, and if you love journeys to uncover forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Late afternoon in the town of Wasilla, Alaska, was covered in the cold gray of late-season snow. Patches of melting ice stained the damp ground, and a light mist rose around the motionless pine trees behind the residential area. In the yard of the Grant family's small wooden house, 8-year-old Ellie and 6-year-old Sadie were playing, passing an old red plastic ball back and forth. Their laughter was steady, mixing with the sound of the wind through the eaves and the slight squelch of their small shoes on the mud. From the kitchen window, their mother, Dana Grant, watched while doing the dishes, occasionally smiling when she saw her 2 daughters argue over whose turn it was to throw the ball. Everything was as normal as any other afternoon during the long spring of the Alaska region. As the sun was about to set behind the mountain range, Dana opened the door to call her children in for dinner. No one answered. She thought they might have run over to the front yard or to a neighbor's house. Stepping onto the porch, Dana looked around. The plastic ball lay forlornly near the fence, and Sadie's pink hair tie was caught on a clump of grass. A gentle breeze stirred everything, but there was no sign of the 2 children. She called out louder, her voice echoing into the silent space and then fading in the wind. A strange feeling arose within her, that excessive silence of the northern afternoon, causing Dana to instinctively quicken her pace. She walked along the fence, continuously calling her daughters' names, checking behind the garage, and then turning onto the small dirt road that ran alongside the woods. Small footprints imprinted in the mud led for a few meters and then vanished. There was no sound, no children's voices answering. Dana returned to the yard, starting to panic, calling out and looking around as if fearing the 2 girls were hiding somewhere. She ran to the neighbor's house, calling out, but no one had seen the 2 children. The sky was darkening, the temperature dropped quickly, and her breath misted into the air. Having searched everywhere around the house, and still finding no sign of her daughters, Dana felt her hands grow cold. She hurried inside, grabbing the landline phone on the kitchen counter. Her hands were trembling as she dialed the number, her voice lost as she connected with the emergency dispatcher. On the other end was a woman's trembling, broken voice, trying to stay calm but mixed with heavy breathing. "My 2 daughters, they've just vanished from the backyard." Linda quickly opened her logbook, asking the woman to confirm her name, address and the last time she saw the 2 girls. Upon learning the caller was Dana Grant in the southern residential area of Wasilla, she immediately marked it Priority 1, Missing Children, and transmitted an urgent signal over the internal system. While Dana struggled to describe what happened, Linda maintained a steady, reassuring voice, instructing her to stay in the house, lock the door, and wait for the patrol car to arrive within minutes. The first patrol car, driven by Officer Ryan Heller, quickly turned onto the small road leading to the Grant house. When the car stopped, 2 officers got out, their flashing lights reflecting off the wet ice on the ground. Dana was standing on the porch, huddled in a thin sweater, her eyes still fixed on the dark backyard. She led them inside, her voice shaky as she recounted what had just happened. Heller took notes while signaling his partner to check the area around the house. The property was illuminated by powerful flashlights, clearly revealing the wet mud. Heller knelt down, discovering a series of fresh children's shoe prints, interspersed with deeply sunken patches of earth. Near the wooden fence, a red plastic baseball bat lay tilted, covered in mud. No drag marks or any other strange objects were seen. He logged the findings, marked the location, and took photos for the file. Under the light, the small footprints led towards the fence and stopped in the middle of the empty space, with no signs of return. Meanwhile, another team searched the porch and the front street. They found no fresh tire tracks or suspicious skid marks. A crime scene technician began collecting mud samples, sealing them in plastic bags, and affixing the case number. The area around the yard was cordoned off with temporary caution tape, preventing outsiders from entering. Inside, Dana sat at the dining table with two other officers. She was asked to describe the detailed characteristics of Ellie and Sadie: clothing, height, hair color, and any items they were carrying. She said Ellie was wearing a blue sweater and jeans. Sadie was in a pink shirt, brown pants, and white boots. Another officer noted information about the neighbors. The Norwood family lived right next door, with a son approximately 14 years old. Police marked this address in the log, placing it on the to-be-interviewed-soon list. Heller quickly reported to the center: 2 female children missing, no signs of struggle at the scene, objects believed to be toys found in the backyard. From the other end of the line, Officer Perez confirmed the file had been forwarded to the commander and activated the emergency search protocol in the area. The news was transmitted to patrol teams on duty within a 20-mile radius of Wasilla. On the ground, scattered snowflakes began to fall again as night enveloped the neighborhood. Officers continued to sweep every corner of the yard, shining lights into drainage ditches, lawns, and the edge of the woods. No new trace appeared. After completing the initial recording, the patrol team drafted a temporary report, sealed the area, and forwarded all scene data to the state level. The disappearance of the Grant sisters was officially escalated for investigation and transferred to the Alaska State Troopers for coordinated handling. When the clock on the patrol car dashboard neared 8 in the evening, the second and third vehicles from the Wasilla Police Department had arrived on the small road leading to the Grant house. Local rescue forces were mobilized immediately that night, bringing high-powered floodlights, handheld megaphones, and police dogs. A 1-kilometer radius around the house was designated as the priority search zone, including the pine forest behind, the open strip of land next to a small stream, and the trail running parallel to the south toward the outskirts of town. Police set up a field command post at the Grant family's garage, using a folding table as the coordination center. Alaska, in April, was no longer bitterly cold, but the night temperature was still low enough to make everyone's breath mist into smoke. Staff wearing reflective vests split into small groups. 2 groups headed toward the forest. 1 group swept along the drainage ditch running around the neighborhood. Flashlights swept across the ground, the light reflecting off the scattered snow and the tall, dark pine canopy. The short barks of the police dogs sounded as they tracked the scent, but quickly fell silent. There was nothing clear to follow. On the dirt road leading into the forest, officers marked every suspicious location: footprints, mud pits, small pieces of fabric blown by the wind. A crime scene technician examined each sample, but none matched the description of the 2 girls' clothing. There were no drag marks, no fresh tire tracks, and no skid marks on the remaining snow. The search gradually extended westward, following the shallow stream, where water babbled over cold rocks. They used lights to scan every section of the water, but only found rocks, moss, and dry branches. Meanwhile, at the front gate of the Grant house, the first group of volunteers began to gather. News spread quickly in the small neighborhood. Neighbors, the girls' schoolmates, and even people from the next town brought flashlights and wore rubber boots to assist. Police divided the area for each group: north to the edge of the forest, south along the main road, and east toward the empty lot of the Norwood house. They walked in horizontal lines, evenly spaced, calling the 2 girls' names as they moved deeper into the darkness. The calls of Ellie, Sadie echoed, mixed with the wind and the barking of the police dogs, but there was no reply other than their own disjointed echoes. Closer to midnight, fog began to settle, obscuring the flashlights and headlights. Kessler, the temporary commander at the scene, received a report. No physical evidence or signs of foul play had been found. He requested the rescue team to change tactics, using a handheld thermal camera, a simple heat detection device the police department was equipped with. However, the teeter was too low, causing the images to be unstable, and the heat signatures found were only small animals moving through the woods. The technical team continued to collect mud samples around the forest to compare with the footprints found in the backyard. A few smaller shoe prints appeared near the ditch, but they were blurred by moisture and flow, making precise analysis impossible. Police set up more fixed floodlights around the perimeter of the neighborhood, turning the area into a hazy zone of light in the Alaska night. Residents stood far back, watching silently, some bringing hot coffee for the search team. No one spoke, only eyes filled with confusion and heaviness. Around 2 a.m., after sweeping the entire 1-kilometer radius around the Grant house, the investigation team concluded that no significant items or traces were found. No blood, no torn pieces of clothing, no abandoned objects. Everything was as if the two children had vanished into thin air. The temporary report clearly stated, no evidence of violence or signs of intrusion found. Footprints stop at the eastern fence, no return direction. Kessler ordered a temporary stand-down to preserve energy for the morning shift. The last people left the forest as the patrol car headlights swept across, illuminating tired faces covered in dew. Equipment, sample bags, and reports were packed and transferred to the Wasilla station for storage. Staying at the Grant house, 2 police officers remained on vigil until morning, in case new information emerged. Dana sat in the living room, staring intently at the yard where her children used to play, while Kessler stood on the porch, writing the final line in the first night's report. Search expanded, no results. Requesting cooperation with the state to continue the investigation. In the Wasilla sky, gray clouds hung low, and the chill lingered after a long, fruitless night of searching. The Maple Drive residential area, just 6 homes bordering the pine forest, was strangely quiet. The yellow caution tape strung around the Grant family's yard still swayed lightly in the wind. In the cold, damp air, every footprint left by the search party from the previous night was smeared into the muddy ground. A convoy of Alaska State Troopers cars had just stopped at the entrance, their headlights sweeping across the row of pines before shutting off. The first person to step out was Lieutenant Aaron Kessler, an experienced investigator dispatched from Anchorage to take over the case. Kessler stepped over the soft mud, his eyes tracing the once peaceful yard of the small wooden house. He carefully observed every detail: a red plastic baseball bat, children's footprints faintly fading into the dirt, and the wooden fence separating the Grant home from the neighbors. The alleged last point of appearance for the 2 children. There were no physical signs of a struggle or a runaway. The scene was too clean, too quiet, a detail that to Kessler was always an anomaly. He briefly jotted down in his notebook, no signs of forced entry, no drag marks, no tire track. With his professional eye, Kessler realized the topography around the neighborhood was almost entirely enclosed. Maple Drive had only one main exit connecting to the highway. The other 2 ends were dead ends, surrounded by pine forest and swampy patches of land. The houses were close together, the residents all knew each other, and virtually no strangers passed through without being noticed. Based on this data, he quickly ruled out the hypothesis of a random kidnap. If someone had come from elsewhere, they would certainly have left a trace, even just tire marks, or a witness hearing an engine running. But here there was nothing at all. As he neared the eastern fence, Kessler stopped. The ground by the base of the fence was moist and had a small gap, just wide enough for a child to squeeze through. A blurred skid mark on the earth showed that a heavy object or person had recently stepped through. He called the forensic technician to measure, photograph, and take samples. There was no direct evidence, but this location matched the direction of the 2 children's footprints, and on the other side of the fence was the Norwood family's house. Kessler looked up and across, an old 2-story wooden house, paint peeling, the upstairs windows tightly shut. He noticed a thin wisp of smoke from the kitchen chimney, indicating someone was inside. Everything was unbelievably normal, as if nothing had happened right next door. He walked closer and rang the doorbell. A middle-aged woman opened the door, Carol Norwood, mother of the boy Caleb, whom Dana Grant had mentioned in her statement the previous night. She greeted him politely, saying she had heard the rescue vehicles the night before but didn't know what was happening. When Kessler asked about her son, Carol replied that Caleb had been home all afternoon, only going out to the backyard for a short time to fix his bicycle before going to bed early. The father worked the night shift at the machine shop, and usually didn't came home until the next morning. During their exchange, Kessler observed the house with professional routine, tidy furnishings, clean floors, but the air held a faint deodorizing scent, the characteristic chemical smell often used to mask dampness or mildew. He made no comment, just recorded the detail in his note. When asked if she had seen the 2 Grant children near her yard, Carol shook her head, saying she was busy cooking, and Caleb had only mentioned hearing children playing by the fence. Kessler thanked her and left, his eyes quickly sweeping across the backyard where patches of mud had been disturbed. Returning to the field command center, he spread the topographic map onto the folding table. Based on the information gathered, Kessler marked the critical area of investigation, a radius that only included the cluster of 6 homes around the Grant residence. He pointed out the small trail leading to the highway to his colleagues, and concluded, if the 2 children had left this area, someone must have seen them, but all the neighbors had confirmed they saw no one, nor heard any vehicle. The enclosed terrain made the possibility of wandering off alone almost zero. In his preliminary assessment sent back to Anchorage, Kessler concluded, the incident area has characteristics of a closed residential community, with minimal through traffic. There is no evidence suggesting the involvement of an unknown outsider. The last known point of appearance of the victims, the fence adjacent to the Norwood house. The statements of residents, especially the Norwood family, require closer scrutiny. Closing his notebook, Kessler stood looking out at the space between the 2 houses, one empty, the other with tightly closed windows, and in his mind, the initial hypothesis formed. This disappearance was not an accident, and the perpetrator might be right here in this neighborhood. The investigation was expanded to the entire Maple Drive residential area the following day. 6 houses lined up along the small road leading into the pine forest, and each one was visited by police for interrogation. Every household was asked to recount the afternoon the incident occurred, any sounds, movements, or strangers that had appeared. Lieutenant Aaron Kessler personally oversaw the interviews, with 2 colleagues taking notes, taking pictures, and mapping the position of each house relative to the last sighting of the 2 children. Most residents had lived there for many years, and were acquainted with both the Grant and Norwood families. They recounted that nothing seemed unusual that afternoon. The weather was dry, and children were playing in the yard as usual. An elderly woman at the end of the street recalled hearing children's laughter, echoing at dusk, but couldn't pinpoint exactly which yard it came from. No one saw strange cars, and no one heard an engine running down the narrow road. Kessler concluded that the neighborhood was entirely quiet at the time, with no suspicious activity. The investigation team lingered longer at the Norwood house, the house adjacent to the fence where the 2 children's footprints had stopped. The door opened, and Miss Norwood greeted them, looking tired but still polite. She stated that she had cooperated with the police the day before, and was ready to continue. Kessler went straight to the question, was she home the entire afternoon? The children went missing, and did she see anything unusual? Carol confirmed she was in the kitchen preparing dinner, only occasionally hearing children's voices playing outside, assuming it was the Grant kids. When asked about Caleb, she said her son was in his room all afternoon, only going out to the backyard briefly to fix his bicycle. Kessler asked permission to meet Caleb to ask a few more questions. The boy appeared from the stairs, thin, with messy hair, wearing a gray sweater. His voice was small and monotone. He said he only saw the 2 Grant sisters throwing a ball in the yard on the other side of the fence, and then he went back inside not knowing what happened after that. Caleb avoided direct eye contact, answering each question briefly. Kessler did not perceive any signs of resistance, but neither did he see the naturalness typical of children his age. He noted this demeanor in his notebook without making a comment. When asked if the police could look inside Caleb's room for verification, Carol hesitated slightly before replying that her son didn't like anyone entering his room. He needs his private space. He often locks the door when drawing or reading. The statement was delivered gently but caught Kessler's attention. He didn't attempt to pressure her because there was no legal basis yet. Any request for a search at this point could be considered a violation. Instead, he simply noted specifically, bedroom locked, no access permit. Mother described son as highly private. As he left the house, Kessler paused on the porch, looking around one last time. The faint deodorizing scent still wafted in the air, the same smell he had noticed the day before. It was the type of industrial room spray often used in hotels, quite strong and uncommon in private homes in this area. He quickly asked Carol about the scent, and she replied, "Because of the damp weather, I often use it to eliminate the smell of mold and mold." The answer was reasonable, but Kessler still marked in his report, "Distinct chemical deodorizer in living space, need to log similar sample if found at another scene." The investigation team moved on to the remaining houses in the area. All statements were consistent: no strange noises, no people passing through, no vehicles seen. Only one couple across the street mentioned seeing Caleb in his yard around sunset, bending down to pick up something from the ground, then quickly going in. When pressed, they said the light was dim then, they couldn't clearly see what he was holding, and they didn't think much of it because it was the neighbor's son. Kessler noted this information, viewing it as a point to be cross-referenced in the comparative report. By the end of the day, all recorded statements were compiled, copied, and entered into the electronic file. Kessler and his team analyzed and synthesized all the information. The results showed no evidence or witnesses to confirm the presence of a stranger in the neighborhood. The circle of suspicion naturally narrowed. Only those living within a few yards of the Grant house remained, and prominent among them was the Norwood family. Kessler did not rush to a conclusion. He knew that relying solely on intuition or impressions could not secure a search warrant, much less launch a deeper criminal investigation without physical evidence. His final report for that day explicitly stated, "All 6 households in the area have been interviewed. No witnesses saw a stranger or suspicious vehicle." The Norwood family cooperated, and their statements align with neighbors' description. The file was transferred to the Alaska State Troopers Central Analysis Unit for statement review and to propose the next steps for investigation. As night fell, Kessler closed his notebook, looking through the car window at the quiet row of houses. The windows were still lit. The wind carried the smell of cold plastic and melting snow. Everything seemed normal, but he clearly sensed it. Hidden beneath this layer of quiet was something wrong. A small detail not yet revealed, but definitely right here in this neighborhood. After completing the neighborhood interrogations, Lieutenant Aaron Kessler held a quick meeting with the investigation team in the field tent set up at the beginning of Maple Drive. On the map spread out before him, he circled the Grant and Norwood homes in red, then expanded it with 2 more half-kilometer radius circles. "We've ruled out the possibility of an outside kidnapping," he stated, "but if the perpetrator intended to conceal something, the woods behind and the drainage system around here are the most likely places to use." An expanded search order was issued that morning, with support from the local rescue team and 2 police dogs brought in from Anchorage. The Wasilla outskirts stretched out in strips of damp land interspersed with drainage ditches and moss-covered low-lying areas. Extending from behind the Grant house to the highway was a network of natural drainage ditches, nearly a meter deep, with many sections connecting to the forest and small streams. The search force was divided into 3 groups, conducting simultaneous sweeps. One group moved along the eastern ditch, one checked the low-lying area behind the row of houses, and the last group combed the edge of the forest bordering the residential area. Each sector was marked with wooden stakes and reflective tape to avoid missing any detail. The morning air was thick with mist and the smell of cold mud. As the weak sun rose, its rays shone through the thin white fog, reflecting on the small puddles like broken glass. The sounds of the police dogs sniffing around mixed with the heavy footsteps of the patrolling officers. Kessler, along with a scene technician, walked along the eastern drainage ditch of the Norwood house, the direction where the terrain sloped downward. Every few dozen meters, he paused to observe, shining his flashlight into the deep sections of the ditch, where murky water flowed slowly through the black mud. Dry branches and decomposed leaves floated sluggishly. Towards mid-morning, a young officer signaled a halt. Something small was weakly reflecting light beneath the mud at the ditch's edge. The technician bent down, using a gloved hand to pick it up. A blue plastic bottle cap. The surface was sticky with mud and had a faint mark of the word Glen. The item was placed on a white plastic sheet for photographing, numbered, and its GPS location recorded. The whole team observed in silence, because this detail, though small, was suspiciously coincident. At the Norwood house, Kessler had noted a similar deodorizing scent. He personally sealed the bottle cap in an evidence bag, labeling it R6A, suspected air freshener cap. For the next few hours, the investigation team continued to sweep the entire ditch route and the low-lying ground. They turned over every piece of wood, shone lights into dense spots, and tentatively dug at a few soft earth locations, but found nothing else related. Kessler requested the technician to collect mud samples around where the bottle cap was found to compare with the soil in the Norwood yard. Looking back at the map, he marked the discovery location, less than 120 meters from the Norwood fence, directly along the natural flow of the drainage ditch. If anything was thrown out to dispose of, it would flow in this direction. When the search extended to the low-lying area west of the houses, the terrain became more difficult to navigate. The mud was deep, sinking to the ankles, and the dense brush required the use of sticks to probe the way. Everyone worked in silence, with only sporadic radio reports of results. No blood traces, no clothing, no signs of a struggle. All samples collected from small fabric scraps, hair to dark-stained branches, were quickly tested on-site and discarded because they did not match the characteristics of the two girls. By the end of the session, Kessler returned to the assembly point, looking at the pile of sample bags on the temporary wooden table. Most contained mud, moss, a few plastic fragments, nothing noteworthy except the blue bottle cap. He considered that this evidence might just be floating trash, but the coincidence of the deodorizer scent and the discovery location meant he couldn't ignore it. A provisional report was drafted immediately. Suspected related item, plastic bottle cap, retrieved near the eastern drainage ditch, sent to the Anchorage Forensic Lab for chemical and fingerprint analysis. In the afternoon, the small convoy carrying the evidence bags left the area. A light rain began to fall, snow melting into water on the car window. Looking through the glass, Kessler saw Maple Drive neighborhood gradually disappearing behind a thin layer of fog, peaceful to an almost unbelievable extent. Theoretically, the case was still in the missing persons search phase, but in his mind, the term missing was no longer accurate. However, to shift the focus to a criminal investigation, he needed concrete evidence, and that small bottle cap might be the first step. That evening, the sample was delivered to the Anchorage Forensic Laboratory, which had chemical analysis equipment. Kessler included a detailed report on the discovery location, and a separate note, need to compare the compound in the bottle cap with the deodorizer scent noted at the Norwood house. The file was logged under case number 8. Everything followed procedure, but inwardly, he knew that the chances of finding new leads were slowly diminishing. 2 days later, the preliminary results were returned. No usable fingerprints. The amount of chemical residue in the cap was very small, making it impossible to determine a match with a specific type of air freshener. The only finding was the component limonene, a common aromatic compound in household air freshener products. Kessler read the results, sitting in silence for a long time. He understood what it meant. The sole piece of evidence was not yet substantial enough to prove anything. The final report for the search operation, concisely recorded. Case expanded search operation completed. No bodies or notable objects discovered. Sole piece of evidence, air freshener cap. Forensic results, did not establish direct relevance. Insufficient grounds to escalate to a criminal investigation. The file was temporarily shelved in limbo. Outside, fresh snow began to fall again, gradually covering the remaining footprints and reflective stakes around the property. For Kessler, everything was back to square one. 2 children were still missing, and every clue seemed to be buried beneath the cold soil of Alaska. In the days following the extended search, the Maple Drive neighborhood gradually returned to its usual quiet, yet the atmosphere in the area had changed. The field command post in front of the Grant house was dismantled, leaving only a few tire tracks etched on the wet ground and a coil of yellow police caution tape tucked inside an officer's gear bag. The investigation team packed up the marker boards, reflective stakes, and floodlights. The streaks of dried mud slowly faded, covered by the first dusting of snow. Everything from the past few weeks, the sound of sniffer dogs, the beam of flashlights, the hoarse shouts of volunteers, vanished as if it had never happened. Lieutenant Aaron Kessler sat in his temporary office at the Wasilla Police Department, looking at the map on the wall. The red circles he had once drawn around the Grant house were now crossed out, symbolizing a completed search area. For 3 weeks, dozens of personnel had scoured every square meter of land around the residential area, sweeping through every ditch, drain and forest edge, but nothing new had surfaced. Not a single piece of evidence, other than a plastic bottle cap, was determined to have forensic value. The final examination results from Anchorage simply stated 2 lines. Insufficient basis to establish a link between the sample and the disappearance. Kessler reread his entire report. Every line was a repetition of emptiness. No traces, no witnesses. The case had fallen into the familiar state of every investigator, the feeling that the answer was close, yet unattainable. He sighed, signed the summary report of the search results, and sent it to the Alaska State Troopers' Southern Region office. The final line of the report explicitly stated, "No concrete evidence to prove criminal activity. File is temporarily archived, pending further instruction." The weather changed faster than expected. By the end of October, temperatures dropped sharply, and the ground froze. The dirt roads around Wasilla became slick, and the ditches were plugged with a thin layer of ice. Continuing the search under these conditions was impossible. Kessler sent a formal proposal to the Anchorage Center: suspend on-site investigation activities, and preserve the file in the Unsolved Crime Archive. On October 29, 2003, the document was approved. On the cover of the file a red stamp clearly read, "Case Status. Cold." News of the investigation's suspension quickly spread through the small community in Wasilla. The local newspaper ran a short headline, "Disappearance of Grant's sisters shows no progress." No one said it aloud, but everyone understood that after more than a month with no leads, hope of finding the 2 girls alive was almost gone. Some volunteers still continued an informal search, walking along creeks or marshlands when the weather was warmer, but they only brought back meaningless fragments, plastic debris, nylon bags, old gloves. The Grant family still lived in the old house. Dana rarely left home, only sitting by the window looking out at the backyard where her 2 children used to play. Mark Grant took a temporary leave from work to be with his wife, but the silence between them grew longer. Inside the house, photos of Ellie and Sadie were placed in every corner, beside them small candles that were lit every evening. Friends and neighbors occasionally visited to offer comfort, but everyone could feel that the house was no longer alive as it once was. In Anchorage, the case file was moved to the Special Archive of the Cold Case Investigation Unit of the Alaska State Troopers. Here, hundreds of files were stacked on shelves, each a pending case, an unanswered question. The file with code AK03227GR was placed on the 3rd row, between 2 other missing persons cases from the previous year. On the spine of the file, Kessler added a handwritten note, still suspecting local involvement, no evidence yet. Occasionally when returning to Anchorage for reporting, Kessler would still pause in front of that file shelf. He didn't believe the 2 children simply disappeared without a trace. The unsettling feeling about the Norwood house still lingered in his mind, the strange deodorizer smell, the locked room, and the quiet demeanor of the boy, Caleb. But the law was the law. When there was no evidence, all speculation had to stop. He reluctantly closed the file, adding a brief line to his work log: "Case open for review upon new evidence." The Alaskan winter arrived early, covering the pine forests and rooftops in white snow. Beneath the thick layer of snow, all remaining traces of the disappearance were buried. The Maple Drive neighborhood fell into a long silence. Every time the wind blew, the remaining strips of caution tape in front of the Grant house gate would rustle softly, like a small reminder of the 2 children who used to play there, and a case now dormant in a frigid file drawer, named Cold Case. Time passed slowly during the Alaskan winter. 6 months after the file on the disappearance of the Grant sisters was moved to Cold Case status, snow still lay thick on the rooftops and small roads of Wasilla. Life on Maple Drive seemed to have returned to normal, but hidden beneath that surface calm was a persistent sense of unease. The Grant family still lived in their old house, and the Norwood house next door was still lit every evening, smoke from the kitchen chimney rising as usual. No one in the neighborhood mentioned the incident anymore, but whenever the wind shifted, blowing across the damp, cold pine trees, people still felt a hard-to-name feeling. One early April afternoon, at the Wasilla police station, the switchboard received a call from a woman who identified herself as Carol Norwood. Her voice was small, hoarse, and full of hesitation. She said that recently a very strange smell had appeared in her house, originating from her son Caleb's room. Carol recounted that she had tried to clean, spray deodorizer, burn incense, and open the window, but the smell wouldn't go away. On the contrary, it was getting heavier. She claimed she didn't dare step further into the room, because something is wrong, and asked the police to come check. When the report was forwarded, the caller's name made Lieutenant Aaron Kessler stop short. For the past 6 months, he had put the case aside, but the word Norwood in the file still haunted him. Without hesitation, Kessler requested to handle the call directly. He and 2 officers left Anchorage, driving for nearly 2 hours to Wasilla in dry, cold weather. When they arrived, the snow had melted, leaving the ground damp and the scent of wet soil permeating the air. Carol greeted them with a look of fatigue and agitation. She explained that the smell appeared about 2 weeks ago, faintly at first, then growing heavier, especially when the weather warmed up. "I thought the pipes had a problem," she said, clutching a wool scarf, but then I realized it was only coming from Caleb's room. The boy, according to her, was currently at school. Kessler clearly saw the anxiety in the woman's eyes. It was no longer the typical reaction when calling the police for a household incident. The Norwood house hadn't changed much since Kessler's last interview. The living room was tidy, warm and bright thanks to the fire in the hearth. However, upon approaching the hallway leading to Caleb's room, a different air immediately enveloped them. Pungent, stifling, and acrid with the smell of chemicals. The familiar deodorizer scent he had noted in his report was now thick, sharp and denser, as if continuously sprayed to mask another smell. Kessler exchanged a look with the accompanying officer, then softly asked Carol if they could check her son's room. She hesitated for a few seconds, then quietly nodded, handing them a bunch of keys. The wooden door opened, and the stench hit them immediately. The room was cold and damp, despite the windows being closed. Faint light penetrated the thick curtains, shining down on the waterbed placed against the wall. Kessler noticed a long streak of dampness on the wooden floor around the base of the bed, like water seeping from within. On the bedside table were 3 nearly empty cans of air freshener, a half-burned box of incense, and a few crumpled pieces of tape. There were no signs of forced entry or struggle, but a heavy atmosphere emanated throughout the space. Kessler signaled for the technician to bring in the recording equipment. He touched nothing, only observed, took notes, and photographed the entire scene. Carol stood outside the hallway, hand covering her mouth, seemingly realizing the seriousness of what was unfolding. When asked one last time, she confirmed the room was always locked, and only her son had the key. Recently, Caleb often kept the door closed all day, only coming out to eat before returning to his room. She thought he was going through a phase of adolescence, and did not press him. After a thorough observation, Kessler stepped out of the room, closed the door, and tried to keep his voice calm. He told Carol that the house needed to be temporarily cordoned off for specialized examination, as there were signs of organic decomposition or chemical leakage. She nodded, tearfully, almost unable to speak. The police team immediately put up caution tape around the area, sealing the door to Caleb's room and the entire upper floor. The preliminary report was sent straight to the trooper's office in Anchorage with a request for an urgent search warrant. While waiting for approval, Kessler stepped out onto the porch, taking a deep breath to escape the heavy smell clinging to his coat. He looked down Maple Drive, where everything was strangely quiet. The snow melted, the ground soft, the trees green again, and the houses still lit. No one in the neighborhood knew that, just a few meters away, the answer to the 6-month-long disappearance might be present. That evening, the comprehensive search warrant was signed. The entire Norwood house, including Caleb's room and the basement area, was designated an official investigation scene. Kessler and the forensic team returned the same night, bringing cameras, evidence bags, and crime scene lights. When they broke the seal and stepped inside, no one spoke. No hypothesis was needed anymore. Stepping across the threshold, everyone understood what awaited them in that room was no longer a harmless odor. The comprehensive search warrant had been approved by the Matanuska-Susitna District Court less than an hour earlier, after Lieutenant Aaron Kessler submitted an urgent report regarding the unusual odor and the potential signs of biological decomposition inside the Norwood house. The car lights cast a long streak of brightness on the damp road surface, reflecting off the dark wood of the house. As the first officers stepped out, the Alaskan cold mingled with a faint chemical smell in the air, an odor Kessler now recognized too clearly, the sickly sweet deodorizer scent that had caught his attention half a year ago. The Norwood house was still lit. Miss Carol Norwood stood waiting on the porch, her eyes empty, tightly clutching a sweater around her. Kessler nodded gently to her, saying briefly, "We will work as carefully as possible." She only nodded silently, then stepped back, letting the police enter. As soon as Caleb's room door was opened, the stench was overwhelmingly suffocating, far surpassing anything they had sensed before. High-powered floodlights were turned on, sweeping across the sealed room, 4 walls painted gray, with no open window. The floor was stained with fluid, mostly concentrated around the waterbed placed against the wall. Empty spray cans lay scattered on the desk, a half-burned box of incense, and a few pieces of tape still clinging to dust. The space was thick with the smell of chemicals, mixed with the odor of decomposition that any seasoned investigator would immediately recognize. Kessler signaled for the crime scene technical team to establish the processing procedure. They donned protective gear, specialized masks, started the video camera, and attached numbers to mark each area. Every step was recorded and reported via radio to ensure the chain of custody. Kessler, along with forensic specialist Dr. Louise Gardner, directly observed and noted down every detail. The waterbed occupied most of the room's space, its surface covered with thick blankets and stained sheets. When 2 technicians began to dismantle the plastic frame underneath, the stench became so heavy that the entire team had to pause to change their mask. Just minutes later, one of the technicians stopped, his voice hoarse through the mask. "We see something underneath." The room fell silent. Kessler stepped forward, bending down. The flashlight beam swept across the gap between the water mattress and the floor panel, catching a patch of light-colored fabric, and then in an instant, he saw something unmistakable. A small hand, discolored skin, rigid in a curled position.
In that moment, no one spoke.
Kessler signaled for everyone to step back, immediately requesting to log the time, 10:48 p.m. He read aloud, "Discovery of an object believed to be a human body. Proceed with confirmation procedure." The 2 technicians carefully widened the bed frame, draining the water out. Dark, thick water, mixed with chemical foam and fabric fragments, flowed out and onto the floor. When the mattress was lifted completely, the entire area underneath was revealed. The body of a little girl, wrapped in a thin blanket, her body curled up, brown hair matted and sticky. Dr. Gardner confirmed. Female gender, consistent with the description of the victim Ellie Grant, age 8. The atmosphere in the room froze. The witnesses were silent, with only the steady whir of the video camera. Kessler stood motionless for a few seconds, then took a deep breath, his voice strained as he read the procedure. "Seal the area, no one leaves their position. Log as a level 1 discovery. We are treating this as a homicide scene." Immediately after, the forensic team began the evidence extraction process. Every object within a 3-meter radius of the bed was considered suspicious. A folding knife with brown rust marks was found under the nightstand. A red plastic baseball bat, stained with dark streaks, was pushed against the corner of the wall. Rolls of tape, still clinging to fabric fibers, were found in the desk drawer. The 3 empty deodorizer cans were collected together, placed into separate evidence bags. Each item was photographed, numbered, sealed, logged with date, time and specific location. Kessler checked each label, signing off as the scene commander. Dr. Gardner and the forensic team worked with the body. They noted moderate decomposition, consistent with a burial time of about half a year in a damp and sealed environment. The body showed signs of compression, the right hand stiffly contracted, the hair matted and sticky, and she was still wearing a pale blue sweater, the very clothes Dana Grant had described in her initial statement. There was no longer any doubt. The body of Ellie Grant had been found. Kessler stood by the door, silently watching the technical team complete the extraction process. He remembered Dana's eyes on the first night when she pleaded for help over the phone. 6 months, hundreds of hours of searching, and finally the answer was right in the house next door. He wondered how many times the investigation forces had walked past this place, how many times they had seen the boy Caleb standing in the yard, never suspecting that just a few meters from the fence lay such a terrible secret. After the body was transferred into a specialized black bag, the examination team took air samples and water samples remaining in the bed frame. The water was murky brown, with a strong chemical odor, likely a diluted deodorizer solution. A desperate attempt to hide the smell of decomposition. The mattress was slit, lined inside with plastic sheets and tape to prevent leakage. Everything was video recorded, disassembled and sealed according to standard procedure. The work was completed after more than 3 hours. As everyone stepped outside, the night wind from the forest blew in, chilling but more breathable than the thick atmosphere inside. Carol Norwood stood huddled on the porch, her face pale. She did not ask, only looked at the dark room behind the caution tape. An officer escorted her to the station for witness protection testimony, while Kessler remained. He looked around the quiet neighborhood, the closed houses, the faint yellow light through the windows. No one knew what had just been found. Before leaving the scene, Kessler wrote a quick report, his hand slightly trembling as he put pen to paper. Found the body of a female victim consistent with the description of Ellie Grant, under the waterbed at the Norwood residence. Evidence recovered: folding knife, plastic baseball bat, adhesive tape, deodorizer cans. The scene is sealed. All evidence and the body are transferred to the Anchorage Forensic Examination Lab for analysis. He signed his name, closed the notebook, then looked up at the last flashlight beam that just turned off in the room. The sound of the door being sealed was soft but definitive. For Kessler, that moment marked a turning point. The missing persons case was no longer a hypothesis. It had become a real murder. News of the discovery of little Ellie Grant's body had not been released. Maple Drive neighborhood remained in chilling silence, with only the yellow police tape faintly visible through the early morning fog. Lieutenant Aaron Kessler held a brief meeting with the forensics team and crime scene technicians, requesting a thorough sweep of the entire area surrounding the Norwood house, especially the drainage points leading toward the pine forest behind the home. He was well aware of the rule of crime: where there is one body, there is likely to be another. In last night's report, Gardner, the forensic specialist, noted that there were no signs of Ellie's body having been moved far, suggesting the perpetrator likely acted on site and disposed of the body quickly. Given the sloping terrain toward the back, the drainage ditch of the Norwood row of houses was a convenient location to discard anything one wished to conceal. The investigation team split into two groups. One group checked the yard, and the small garden behind the house. The other group, led by Kessler himself, walked along the drainage ditch that flowed down to the low-lying area, where there were patches of frozen water and old unmelted snow. The early morning wind carried a biting chill. The ground was frozen, and footsteps crunched on the hard gravel. Flashlight beams cut weak streaks of light through the thick fog, shining down on the long narrow ditch, about half a meter wide, which snaked through the bushes and paused at a bend. A young officer bent down, shining his light onto a patch of opaque ice clinging to the edge of the ditch. Beneath the old snow, something was protruding, a small dark piece of fabric, curled by the current. Kessler immediately signaled for a halt, calling for the technicians to inspect it. They used small shovels to gently scrape away the snow. The ice began to crack, revealing a black void underneath. As the flashlight beam penetrated deep, the image that appeared left no one in the group speaking. A small stiff hand lay there, reaching out from the block of ice, the pale skin almost translucent. The forensics team was summoned immediately. The area was cordoned off with reflective tape and wooden stakes. Cameras, temperature and light measuring devices were set up around the scene. The air temperature at that time was below -3 degrees Celsius, causing the remaining part of the body to be completely frozen in the ice and mud. The excavation had to proceed slowly, layer by layer, to avoid damage. After nearly 2 hours of work, when the ice was entirely removed, the small body was gradually revealed. It was a little girl, about 6 years old, wearing a pink jacket and brown pants, matching the description of Sadie Grant in the missing persons file. The body was discovered lying on its side, arms tucked in, face turned toward the forest. The clothing was intact, with no signs of assault or dragging. A thick layer of ice covered her, stuck tightly to the ditch wall, evidence that the body had been there all winter, gradually covered by water and freezing over time. Dr. Gardner knelt down, conducting a preliminary examination of the scene before the body was moved. She assessed that the victim died at the same time as her older sister, based on the degree of decomposition and the condition of the soft tissue. There were no signs of being attacked with a sharp object. As with Ellie, the high probability was suffocation, or asphyxiation. Kessler quickly jotted down in his notebook, same day, same area, 2 victims, single perpetrator. The body was carefully separated from the ice layer, placed in a specialized preservation bag, and transported to the Anchorage examination room, along with the evidence collected at the Norwood house. Every action was videotaped and confirmed by the person in charge. When the body bag was hauled ashore, everyone stood in silence. Kessler looked up at the band of police tape near the Norwood house in the distance. 2 locations, separated by just over 100 meters, but now linked in the same case. As the forensic vehicles drove away, he stayed at the scene with the technical team for one last sweep. Near the edge of the ditch, they found several small fragments of gray fabric matching the material of the blanket wrapped around Ellie's body. This detail was collected as a reference sample, bolstering the hypothesis that both bodies may have been disposed of within the same time frame. Late in the afternoon, a preliminary report was drafted right at the scene. Kessler read it aloud to the investigation team, based on the finding of the second body, identified as Sadie Grant, age 6. The 2 scenes are directly linked to the same subject, with the crime committed at the same time. Recommendation to upgrade case file AK-0327 to a double homicide investigation. He signed the record, then stood silently for a moment, looking along the long ditch leading into the forest. The snow was still slowly melting, water trickling, carrying mud and fragments of broken ice far away. A heavy feeling washed over his chest. For the past 6 months, he had a hunch that this case would not stop at one missing child, but the sight of the second body made everything more real than ever. When Kessler returned to the Norwood house, the technical team was still working inside to clean up and finalize the first crime scene file. He stepped onto the porch, stopping before the doorway. The smell of deodorant, though somewhat carried away by the wind, still lingered in the air, mingling with the scent of damp earth. Across the fence, the Grant family's house was silent, the curtains drawn tight. He knew he would have to face them soon, but not as someone who was searching for hope, but as someone who brought painful truth. Kessler opened his notebook and wrote the final line, Sadie Grant's body found in the frozen ditch behind the Norwood house. 2 scenes confirm the same perpetrator. Case officially upgraded. Double homicide investigation. The wind from the pine forest blew, gently rustling the strips of ceiling tape. Kessler closed the notebook, slowly stepped down the stairs, leaving behind 2 houses, one holding a guilty secret, and one holding an unspeakable pain. In the following days, the entire town of Wasilla seemed to pause. The 2 small bodies were transferred to the Anchorage Forensics Lab, while the Norwood house was completely cordoned off, turning into a state-level crime scene investigation. Yellow caution tape stretched across the fence, displaying signs that read, "Do not enter, active crime scene." No one was allowed in, not even the homeowners. Inside, the technical team from the Alaska State Forensic Center began an extended analysis, aiming to answer the question that the entire community was waiting for: what truly happened in Caleb Norwood's room. The forensic file was coded AFD 03227GR, containing dozens of exhibits: a folding knife, a plastic baseball bat, adhesive tape, a deodorant bottle, a water sample from the bed, the fabric used to wrap the body, along with over 20 biological trace samples collected from the scene. Each sample was sealed following strict protocol. Additionally, tissue and hair samples from the 2 victims were collected after the autopsies. The head of the forensics department, Dr. Louise Gardner, directly supervised the analysis. The first results emerged after just 3 days. The DNA of both victims, Ellie and Sadie Grant, was detected in Caleb Norwood's room. Analysis using the STR, short tandem repeat, technique showed microscopic blood traces on the underside of the waterbed mattress, matched Ellie's blood sample. Furthermore, Sadie's DNA sample was also present on the adhesive tape and the blanket fabric found with her body, proving that both children had been in this room. That was undeniable evidence. The room was not just a place to hide the bodies, but the location where the murders occurred. Concurrently, the fingerprint analysis team completed their report. Fingerprints matching Caleb Norwood were found on the baseball bat, the folding knife, and the cap of the deodorant bottle. Some smaller fingerprints were identified as Ellie's, likely left when the 2 children were playing nearby. No other adult fingerprints were detected. Shoe prints at the scene, a size 8 juvenile, also matched the athletic shoes Caleb wore to school, which were seized from the storage room. Chemically, the analysis results of the deodorant compounds at both scenes, Caleb's room and the water ditch where Sadie was found, showed an almost perfect match in composition. Both contained the distinctive ratio of limonene and benzyl acetate of a single room spray product, the Glade Blue Mist brand. This trace evidence matched the blue bottle cap that the investigation team had discovered 6 months earlier. The link between the old evidence and the new scene sent a chill down Kessler's spine. A detail that seemed meaningless at the time now fit perfectly. The autopsy report was finalized after 5 days. Gardner noted that both victims died on the same day, late in the afternoon, based on the state of decomposition, tissue dryness, and environmental data in the room. Ellie suffered a blunt force trauma to the head, most likely from the baseball. Afterward, there were signs of a small knife wound in the chest area, not deep, but causing blood loss. Sadie had no significant superficial wounds. Her lung tissues were contracted with minor hemorrhage, suggesting the possibility of mechanical asphyxiation, being suffocated or compressed. The time of death for the two girls differed by no more than 1 hour. The forensics lab concluded both victims died on the same day, in the same enclosed space. Based on physical evidence and biological traces, the perpetrator is likely a resident of the Norwood house. Primary scene: Caleb Norwood's room. The report, over 80 pages thick, was sent directly to Lieutenant Kessler's office. He read every line in silence, gripping the stack of papers tightly. 6 months ago, when the file was closed, he had written a line in his journal, still suspecting internal area factors, no evidence yet. Now all the evidence was clearly apparent, from DNA, fingerprints, to chemical compounds, and time of death. All pointed to the same person, Caleb Norwood, 14 years old. Kessler carefully compared the map of the two crime scenes. The distance between Caleb's room and the water ditch where Sadie was found was just over 120 meters, close enough to transport the body quickly. With the height and physical strength of a teenager, disposing of the second body was entirely feasible. The chemical report proved he tried to use room spray to mask the smell of decomposition, even adding tape to seal the waterbed. The effort to conceal the crime showed he was fully aware of the consequences of his actions, which would be a legal focal point in the indictment. When reading the last part of the report, Kessler paused for a long time at Dr. Gardner's handwritten note. The extent of the injuries and the arrangement of the bodies suggest the action was not entirely spontaneous, but rather calculated, even if the incident began as an accident. He placed the report on the desk, looking up at the photograph of the two children he had kept in the missing persons file, their bright smiles in the sun, their innocent eyes now only existing in a forensic report. He knew his next task: to transfer the entire file to the Alaska State Prosecutor's Office to prepare for criminal indictment. That afternoon, Kessler's car drove out of Wasilla, heading toward Anchorage. On the passenger seat was the thick file, the cover printed with a bold line, Case UP Jaded, Double Homicide, State of Alaska vs. Caleb Norwood. He did not look back. Everything was now out of the hands of the investigating police. The truth was known, and the rest would belong to the court. But in his mind, the artificial scent of deodorant still lingered, the cloyingly sweet smell that covered death, and also the smell of unforgivable guilt. Monday morning, the Wasilla sky was covered with a thin layer of fog. Mat-Su Valley High School was quiet as usual, the murmur of student conversations echoing down the hallway. None of them knew that the school day would be interrupted by an event that would shake the entire town. Lieutenant Aaron Kessler, along with 2 officers from Anchorage, quietly parked outside the school gates. In the car, he reopened the file. The DNA report, fingerprints, autopsy report, all pointed to the same person. The line on the last page from the Alaska State Prosecutor was printed in bold: arrest warrant, Caleb Norwood, 14 years old, first-degree murder suspect. Kessler read it one more time to ensure every detail was valid. Arresting a minor was never easy, especially when he was a student in a small, familiar community. He instructed his team: no commotion, no handcuffs in front of students, no public disclosure of identity until the legal process was completed. The 3 officers entered the main building and presented the warrant to the principal. The middle-aged man froze, his face turning pale when he heard the student's name mentioned in the warrant. Just a few minutes later, an administrative staff member escorted Caleb from the classroom to the office. He wore a gray sweater, jeans, and carried a backpack, looking no different from any other teenager. When he saw the police, Caleb paused briefly, his eyes wide, then looked around as if waiting for someone to explain what was happening. Kessler stood up, his voice calm but firm. Caleb Norwood, you are under arrest by order of the Alaska State Court, in connection with the murder of Ellie and Sadie Grant. You have the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. The atmosphere in the room was heavy. Caleb stood still, not saying a word. His hands were clasped together, fingers clenched until they were white. Kessler gently placed a hand on his shoulder, signaling the other officer to take the back. To avoid drawing attention, they escorted him through the back door, where the police car was waiting. Some students in the yard watched, their faces surprised, not understanding what was happening. On the way to Anchorage, Kessler sat in the front seat, his eyes looking straight through the windshield. In the back, Caleb was silent, his face turned toward the window, the morning light reflecting off his pale skin. There were no tears, no defense, just the heavy silence of someone who knew that all secrets had come to an end. At the Alaska State Troopers headquarters in Anchorage, Caleb was taken to a special interrogation room for minors. Carol Norwood was present as his guardian, her face haggard, eyes red and swollen. Next to her was the court-appointed lawyer, John Mercer, who specialized in defending minors in serious criminal cases. Kessler reread the suspect's full legal rights, then deferred to the Alaska State Prosecutor, David Holbrook, who had personally signed the arrest warrant. Holbrook briefly presented the charges, based on the results of the forensic examination, fingerprints, DNA and evidence collected at the scene. The state of Alaska is indicting Caleb Norwood with 2 counts of first-degree murder, under Title 11. Lawyer Mercer requested his client not to answer until the full file had been consulted. Caleb maintained his posture, eyes downcast at the table, hands clasped. When asked if he understood his rights, he nodded very slightly. Carol could not hold back, bursting into tears, while Kessler just looked down at the file in front of him, avoiding the mother's gaze. After the interrogation, Caleb was transferred to the Anchorage Juvenile Detention Center, a high-security facility but unlike a conventional prison. He was kept completely isolated, with no access to the press or outsiders. The indictment was sent to the Alaska State Supreme Court that same day. On Kessler's desk in Wasilla, the copy of the indictment read in a cold line, State of Alaska, Caleb Norwood, 2 counts of first-degree murder. He read the line over and over, then gently closed the file. 6 months ago, this was an unsolved missing person case. Now 2 children had been found, and the perpetrator, just a 14-year-old boy, was awaiting trial for an unimaginable crime. Outside, the snow was slowly melting, the damp ground reflecting the pale yellow lights of the small town. No one said it aloud, but all of Wasilla knew, the peace of this place would never return to what it once was. The interrogation room was small, stark white and cold, containing only a metal table, 3 chairs and a recording camera in the corner. The fluorescent light shone down on Caleb Norwood's face, making his skin appear even paler. He sat still, his hands tightly clasped, his back slightly hunched, his eyes fixed on the empty space on the table. Facing him were Lieutenant Aaron Kessler, who had been on the case from the start, along with Prosecutor David Holbrook and Defense Attorney John Mercer. Next to Caleb, his mother, Carol Norwood, sat silently, gripping a tissue. The atmosphere was thick and heavy. After confirming the legal procedures, Kessler turned on the recorder and spoke slowly. Caleb, we are here to hear the truth. You have the right to remain silent, but this is your chance to tell us exactly what happened to Ellie and Sadie Grant. The boy did not answer. A long silence passed, broken only by the light tapping of the prosecutor's pen on the table. Kessler slowly placed a photo of the room on the table. The slashed waterbed, the deodorant bottle, and the blanket covering the body. Caleb glanced at it, then turned away, his lips trembling slightly. When Kessler spoke again, his voice was deep and husky. The evidence shows that both girls were in your room. No one else could have entered that house. Can you explain what happened? He took a deep breath, his hands clenched, then suddenly released. His voice was small but clear. I didn't mean to hurt them. I swear I didn't mean to. Kessler sat still, waiting, and after several long pauses, the story began to spill out, fragmented, shaky, yet coherent enough to piece together a gruesome picture of that afternoon. Caleb recounted that he was home alone that day. His father was working the night shift, and his mother was out buying groceries. While playing ball in the yard, Ellie Grant accidentally threw the ball over the fence. The girl came over to retrieve it, and they started talking. He told Ellie she could play for a few minutes, provided she wasn't noisy. They played catch in the backyard. At one point as Ellie ran up, the ball hit her head. She screamed, and then she cried. Caleb recalled, his voice choking. I was scared. Scared my dad would get mad because I let a friend inside. He doesn't like other kids coming over. Caleb said he led Ellie into his room to get a cloth to wipe the blood, but she continued to cry, the sound echoing through the house. In a panic he tried to make her quiet. I just wanted her to stop screaming. I didn't know what I was doing, he whispered. I grabbed the baseball bat and I hit her head once. No one in the room moved. Kessler looked directly at the boy, his eyes heavy. The prosecutor took notes, while Miss Carroll covered her mouth, tears rolling down her face. Caleb continued, his voice so faint it was barely audible. She fell down, still breathing. I was so scared. I dragged her into the room and put her under the waterbed. I thought it would only be for a few minutes, and then everything would be fine. About half an hour later, Sadie Grant, Ellie's younger sister, came over, calling for her. I heard a knock in her little voice. She asked where her sister was. I didn't know what to say. When Kessler asked what he did next, Caleb lowered his head. I told her to wait at the door, and then I told her Ellie was hurt, but she was going to run and tell her mom, so I held her back. His voice broke, and his hands clenched, making his knuckles white. I was confused. I was just afraid everyone would find out, so He stopped, then whispered almost soundlessly, I made her stop breathing. According to the confession, after Sadie stopped moving, Caleb wrapped her in a thin blanket, dragged her out to the drainage ditch behind the house as dusk fell, and returned to his room. He cleaned the stains, sealed the waterbed, and covered it with a blanket and sheet. When his mother returned, he pretended to be doing his homework. When people asked, I said I didn't know. When the police came, I went out to search with them, he said, his eyes red-rimmed. I just wanted to believe that it wasn't real. The entire confession aligned almost perfectly with the forensic results. The location of Ellie's injuries, the condition of Sadie's body, the fingerprints, and the sequence of actions in the room. The report showed that Caleb did not act on a single impulse. He had cleaned the scene, concealed the bodies, and lived with the corpses for months, trying to cover it up with deodorizers and incense. That behavior clearly demonstrated an awareness of guilt and an ability to control his actions, which Prosecutor Holbrook noted directly in the transcript. Intentional behavior, not an unconscious reaction. When the interrogation concluded, Kessler turned off the recorder. He looked at the boy before him, not a violent person with crazed eyes, but a small, confused teenager, so terrified that he lost all boundaries between right and wrong. But that did not lessen the guilt. The truth was clear. Caleb Norwood was the perpetrator of both murders. Kessler stood up, giving a slight nod to the prosecutor. Across the table, Mrs. Carroll slumped in her chair, sobbing silently, while Caleb remained still, his eyes wide and vacant, fixed on the white wall in front of him. The camera continued to record for a few more seconds, then the screen slowly faded to black. On the final transcript, the text was clearly typed, the suspect's confession is consistent with all scene evidence and forensic examination results. The act of concealment, prolonged over several months, proves a clear criminal awareness. The case qualifies for criminal prosecution with the charge of first-degree murder, double homicide. 3 days after Caleb Norwood admitted to the full extent of his actions, the Alaska State Investigation and Forensics Team proceeded to reconstruct the crime at the scene. The Norwood house was unsealed for the first time since the night the bodies were discovered. The first snow of the season was melting, the ground was damp, and the cold Arctic light cast a heavy pall over the already somber setting. The quiet footsteps of the technical team echoed softly through the frighteningly silent house. Lieutenant Aaron Kessler stood with Dr. Louise Gardner, the lead forensic scientist, by the coordination table. Before them were detailed scene diagrams, photographic angles of each area, and a proportional scale model reconstructed by the technician. Every arrow, every line on the diagram was a moment reliving the tragedy that occurred in just a few hours that afternoon last year. Based on the confession, forensic data, and physical evidence, Kessler and the technical team determined the initial timeline was around. Ellie Grant and Caleb were playing ball in the backyard. The ball accidentally struck Ellie's head. A light blow, not fatal, but it made her cry. The boy panicked, fearing his father would be angry if he found out a little girl was in the house. According to the simulation, Caleb led Ellie into his room to wipe the blood. The small injury caused her pain and panic, her cries echoing through the hallway. Combining this with the autopsy results, showing a stronger impact force at the back of the head, the experts concluded that the fatal blow did not come from the ball, but from a plastic baseball bat. That blow created a skull fracture, causing immediate loss of consciousness. This was an intentional act, not to be considered an accident. Around 5 p.m., while Ellie was unconscious on the floor, Caleb attempted to hide her. He pulled a blanket, intending to conceal her under the waterbed. While he was struggling, Sadie Grant, Ellie's younger sister, appeared, calling for her sister from across the fence. Sadie's fingerprints were found on the back door frame and on the cap of the room spray bottle, consistent with Caleb's description that the girl had stepped inside the room. From there, everything happened very quickly. Near the bed, forensics identified Sadie's handprint on the wooden floor, oriented toward the door, indicating she had tried to run. There were no signs of a prolonged struggle, only a slight slip mark and a small scratch on her wrist. Experts deduced that Caleb restrained Sadie to muffle her, leading to mechanical asphyxia, causing death within minutes. That was the cause of death determined in the autopsy report. Afterward, the boy panicked. In his confession, Caleb said he didn't know what to do and just wanted to hide it so no one would find out. The reconstruction showed he dragged Ellie's body, which was still faintly breathing, down under the waterbed, used duct tape to seal the edge of the frame, and covered it with a blanket and sheet. The water in the bed helped keep the temperature low, preventing decomposition odor from appearing immediately. He wiped the floor, gathered the sisters' clothes and toys, and hid them. As twilight set in, Caleb wrapped Sadie's body in the thin blanket, dragged her through the back door to the drainage ditch behind the house. The path of movement was confirmed by a trail of mud and size 8 shoe prints, matching his own shoes, which were collected from the shed. The depth of the ditch and the low temperature caused Sadie's body to quickly freeze overnight, preserving it almost intact for half a year. In the 3D model reconstructed from the scene photos, Kessler marked 3 main points: the location of the blow to Ellie, the location of Sadie's death, and the location of the body concealment. All distances were less than 10 feet. The bedroom was less than 80 square feet, but within that confined space, 2 lives were taken, and for the next half a year, the perpetrator lived right above the victim's body. The forensic report also showed that after the incident, Caleb tried to mask the smell of the body by continuously spraying deodorant and burning incense. Limonene, benzyl acetate, and isopropyl alcohol compounds were detected in high concentrations in the air and on the wall surfaces, the same type as the Glade Blue Mist bottle collected by the police. He also reinforced the bed frame with duct tape to prevent water leakage, demonstrating deliberation in his actions. These details, combined with the timeline from 4:30 p.m. to 6 p.m., indicate that Caleb did not act in a state of complete unconsciousness or loss of control. Despite his panic, he made a series of specific decisions: concealing the bodies, cleaning the scene, masking the smell, and then pretending to search with the neighbors. These were sequential steps, demonstrating a clear awareness of guilt. When the reconstruction was complete, Dr. Gardner read a brief conclusion before the camera. Based on the physical evidence, forensic analysis, and confession, the case was not an accident. The first blow was intentional, and the acts of concealment and aftermanagement were calculated. Both victims died within the same time frame. Case classification: double homicide, intentional act under fear response. Kessler stood silently, looking at the now empty room. The light shone down on the wooden floor, reflecting dark patches where the bodies had once been placed. Every detail matched. Every piece of evidence confirmed what he had suspected from the beginning. This was no longer an unintentional tragedy, but a premeditated act of murder, carefully hidden beneath a veneer of fear. As the forensic team packed up their equipment, Kessler wrote the final lines in the summary report. Scene reconstruction complete. Suspect's actions clearly demonstrate awareness of consequences. The case is recommended to move to the state criminal trial phase. He closed the notebook, glancing at the line of pine trees behind the house casting long shadows on the ground. Everything was clear, but no one in the team felt relieved. In that room, even though the snow outside had melted, the cold still lingered, a cold that didn't come from the Alaskan climate, but from the truth that had just been reconstructed before their eyes. September 2004, nearly a year after the case was discovered, the Anchorage Superior Court was packed. Local press, Alaska State Television, and dozens of reporters from national newspapers were present, all wanting to cover the trial deemed the most serious double homicide case in the Matanuska-Susitna region in decades. On the left side of the courtroom, 14-year-old Caleb Norwood sat silently in a gray correctional uniform, his hands clasped on the table. Beside him were his court-appointed defense attorney, John Mercer, and his mother, Carol Norwood, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed. Opposite them, Alaska State Prosecutor David Holbrook represented the prosecution, along with Lieutenant Aaron Kessler, the lead investigator, and Dr. Louise Gardner, the head of the forensic team, seated in the witness section. Judge Eleanor Rawlings, who had over 20 years of experience presiding over juvenile criminal cases, chaired the trial. She began in a calm but grave voice. Today's trial is for the case of the state of Alaska versus Caleb Norwood on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Everyone present in this room understands the severity of this matter. The prosecution opened with a clear summary. Holbrook presented the entire investigation process, from the initial missing persons report to the discovery of the 2 bodies. He detailed the physical evidence, Caleb's fingerprints on the baseball bat and folding knife, the DNA of both victims in the bedroom, the matching chemical composition of the deodorizer between the 2 scenes, and the scene reconstruction results performed by the forensic team. Every image, every video clip was projected onto a large screen behind the bench. The waterbed, the layer of duct tape, the empty room spray bottle, and the map showing the location where Sadie's body was found in the frozen ditch. When Kessler was called to the witness stand, the room fell silent. He recounted the sequence of events in a calm, detailed, non-judgmental voice, from the first call from Caleb's mother, to the moment he opened the bed frame and saw Ellie's small hand sticking out. He described the disbelief upon discovering that the perpetrator was the very child who lived next door to the victims, who had once handed out search flyers with the rescue team. Kessler's words were not accusatory, yet they carried more weight than any legal argument. Next, Gardner presented the forensic report. Both victims died on the same day, Ellie from a blow by a blunt object and a stab with a knife, and Sadie from asphyxiation, all occurring in Caleb's room. Deodorizer chemicals, bloodstains and tissue samples all matched. She concluded clearly, there is no basis to suggest this was an accident. The months-long acts of concealment demonstrate that the subject was fully aware of what he had done. After the prosecution finished its presentation, Attorney John Mercer stood up, his voice low and deliberate. He did not deny the evidence, nor did he attempt to overturn the autopsy results. That was impossible. He chose a different angle. Caleb was a child. Your Honor, Mercer said, my client was only 14 years old at the time of the crime. He acted in a state of panic, under the pressure of fear of his father, a strict, sometimes violent man. Caleb did not fully comprehend the consequences of his actions. This was not a premeditated crime, but a series of mistakes beginning with an accident. The defense called Carol Norwood as a witness. Her voice trembled as she spoke about her volatile husband, and how Caleb was always afraid of being scolded for minor mistakes. She said, I don't excuse my son, but I know he was never a cruel child. When she finished, many people in the room were quietly moved. However, Prosecutor Holbrook immediately rebutted. He pointed to the screen showing the evidence photos, the deodorant bottle neatly placed, the duct tape tightly wrapped around the bed frame, the waterbed carefully reinforced. A child in a state of panic cannot carry out a series of sequential actions, over many consecutive days, to hide bodies and mask the smell. This is no longer fear, this is calculation to evade justice. The entire courtroom was hushed when Holbrook read the final part of the indictment. Defendant Caleb Norwood is charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder against victims Ellie and Sadie Grant. Pursuant to Alaska Criminal Code Section 100, the maximum penalty is life imprisonment without parole. Judge Rawlings listened to the 2 sides argue for 3 full days. The trial concluded on Wednesday afternoon. As she held the verdict, the light from the window slanted across the cold wooden bench. Her voice was firm. The court finds that the defendant, Caleb Norwood, although a minor at the time of the offense, had a clear awareness of the consequences of his actions, demonstrated by cleaning the scene, hiding the bodies, and misleading authorities. The actions were intentional, constituting the crime of first-degree murder. She hit the gavel, announcing the sentence, life imprisonment, without parole. There was no murmuring in the courtroom. Carol Norwood collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably. Caleb sat still, his eyes wide and vacant, without shedding a single tear. Attorney Mercer placed a hand on his shoulder, saying something softly that no one could hear. As the officers escorted Caleb out of the room, he glanced back at his mother one last time, before turning away. The door closed, leaving behind the rustle of papers and the heavy sighs of the witnesses. On the judge's bench, the case file was closed with the prominent red lettering, State of Alaska, Vifi Caleb Norwood, convicted. Life imprisonment, without parole. Outside the courthouse, the snow began to fall lightly. The people of Wasilla heard the news on the evening broadcast, and were silent for a long time. They had searched for the two missing children in the freezing cold, but no one ever suspected that the devil wore the face of a boy who lived right in their neighborhood. The case was closed, but a heavy silence settled over Alaska for many years afterward, a silence colder than the Arctic winter. The 14-year-old was sentenced to life in prison without parole, transferred to the state's juvenile detention facility, awaiting transition upon reaching legal adulthood. But for the investigating force, the journey was not over. They had one last job to do: archive the entire file and all evidence from the double homicide case that had shaken the entire state of Alaska. Lieutenant Aaron Kessler returned to Anchorage in the final days of the year, as heavy snow began to fall thick on highways. In his vehicle were the final 2 boxes of evidence being transported from Wasilla back to the State Investigation Center. Small, insignificant fragments that nonetheless held the entire story of the crime. They included the red plastic baseball bat, the folding knife, duct tape, 3 empty deodorant spray cans, and the fabric fragment of the blanket used to wrap Sadie Grant's body. All had been cleaned, dried, double-sealed and marked with evidence codes, A through F, filed under the original case number. At the Anchorage Scientific Crime Detection Center, the evidence storage room was located deep in the basement, with a stable temperature of 12 degrees Celsius, 53.6 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, to ensure the preservation of sample. Kessler signed the transfer protocol witnessed by 2 forensic examiners. The evidence was carefully placed onto metal shelving, each item recorded into the electronic system, labeled with a barcode and a seal number. When finished, he signed the last line beneath the bold print: "Case closed, evidence retained indefinitely." After more than a year dedicated to the case, Kessler watched the evidence boxes being pushed deep into the shelves, among hundreds of other files. The sound of the metal wheels rolling on the floor was faint, and then the heavy steel door closed with a cold clank. He knew this was the official end. The case was closed in terms of investigation, but its memory would forever remain in the reports, the documents, and in the minds of those who had witnessed it. At the same time, the Norwood house, where the 2 bodies were found, became a black spot in the community. No one dared to buy it, even though the asking price dropped to only 1/3 of the market value. The house was abandoned, windows broken, the roof leaky, and locals often avoided walking past that street at night. After months without tenants, the Wasilla city government decided to demolish the entire structure to remove the haunting image from the community. When the demolition crew arrived, Kessler was present at the scene. He stood far away, watching the excavator crush the old wooden frame, the peeling faded paint, fragments scattering onto the icy ground. For a moment, he saw again the image of the first night he entered that room, the overwhelming smell of deodorant, the damp floor, and Ellie's small hand sticking out from the waterbed frame. That scene was imprinted in his memory, and perhaps would never. When the last wall tumbled, he only gave a slight nod. A chapter closed. The following February, the Norwood case file was officially included in a special training program of the Alaska State Troopers called Cold Case in Arctic Conditions. This was a research program on investigation methods in extreme cold climate conditions, where low temperatures and ice directly affect case-solving progress. File AK-03-227-GR became a prime example for combining juvenile criminal psychological investigation, forensic examination, and exploitation of environmental evidence. The images recorded at the scene, from the locked room to the icy ditch where the second body was discovered, were used as teaching materials. In the training class in Anchorage, new investigators were required to thoroughly read Kessler's report, especially the initial notes he once considered a vague feeling about the smell of deodorant. That small detail had become the turning point in solving the case. An instructor commented, "In the harsh conditions of Alaska, time can blur all traces, but the investigators' experience and intuition are the only things that cannot be frozen. For Kessler, the Norwood file was not just a closed case, but a bitter reminder of human limitation. For the first 6 months he had thought he had failed, that the 2 children were forever lost under the cold snow. Now, looking back at every duplicated and archived report in the system, he understood that justice had finally been found, even if it came at the cost of a tragedy no one wanted to revisit. During the agency's year-end summary, when a colleague asked him how he felt about the Norwood case, Kessler simply replied, "There are some cases that never truly end, they just go quiet, like the snow covering everything, but underneath, the truth remains." Outside, Anchorage at night, yellow lights reflected on the thin layer of snow covering the central parking lot. In the basement of the investigation building, the evidence boxes marked AK-0327-GR lay still on the cold steel shelves. The case had been archived, the house had vanished, but the name Norwood and the 2 children Ellie and Sadie Grant remained in the files, in the lesson, and in the memory of those who lived through that winter. A winter of guilt and truth. 20 years passed since the sentence was pronounced. In the spring of 2023, Caleb Norwood's name once again appeared on the front page of the Anchorage Daily News. The case that was once considered closed was brought up for resentencing, based on the precedent Miller v. Alabama, 2012, a U.S. Supreme Court ruling that mandated that sentencing juveniles to life without parole could be considered unconstitutional if it did not take into account factors of circumstance and potential for rehabilitation. The appeal was submitted by a legal organization protecting the rights of juveniles, arguing that the life sentence for Caleb, who committed the crime when he was only 14, needed to be reviewed. The Anchorage Superior Court accepted the case, opening a special resentencing hearing in April. Under a sky still shedding light snow, those who had followed the case 2 decades earlier returned to the courtroom that had pronounced the 2004 sentence. Retired Lieutenant Aaron Kessler was also present, this time as a witness and consultant for the resentencing file. He had left the force 8 years prior, his hair white, but his steps were still slow and steady. In his hand was a thick stack of reports, a 20-year summary of the investigation, archiving and post-case monitoring, a document the Alaska Department of Law had requested him to complete for the hearing. The defense argued that Caleb had been rehabilitated during his 20 years of imprisonment, participating in vocational programs, psychological therapy, and expressing a sincere attitude of remorse. His new attorney, Marilyn Hayes, argued, when he committed the crime, Caleb was a child living in an environment of fear, lacking direction, heavily influenced by his father. He did not have the ability to control his emotions and did not fully understand the consequences of his actions. Over the past 20 years, Caleb has shown significant change. However, the prosecution strongly refuted this. Representing the state of Alaska, prosecutor Jacob Morales presented that old evidence, along with new documents deciphered from Caleb's personal computer hard drive from 2000. Previously, the computer data was locked with simple encryption and largely deemed useless, but thanks to modern data recovery technology, the state's Digital Investigation Unit reopened the old drive. It contained numerous log files and downloaded images just hours before the crime occurred, video clips and articles containing violent and deviant content about children. A few short notes in a text file showed the boy had written about wanting to see what happens when others are afraid of me. The technical report confirmed the access time coincided with the afternoon time frame of the murders. Prosecutor Morales concluded, these data prove that Caleb's behavior was not entirely a reaction in panic, but carried elements of deviant curiosity and control. Concealing the bodies, using deodorant, and feigning participation in the search cannot be considered unconscious acts. The courtroom fell silent as those journal entries were read. Caleb, now 34, sat still, his head bowed low. His appearance was now calm, his face thin, his hands placed neatly in front of him. When allowed to speak, Caleb said briefly, I am not looking for justification. I have lived half my life in prison, and I know I do not deserve freedom. I only hope that Ellie and Sadie's parents can find peace. His voice was low, hoarse, not shaky, not dramatic, but for those present in the courtroom, they did not perceive true remorse. Only the cold acceptance of someone who understood there was no turning back. After 3 days of deliberation, Judge Eleanor Rawlings, who had pronounced the sentence in 2004, returned to read the resentencing decision. In the final ruling she wrote, "The court has considered all factors, the defendant's age at the time of the crime, the time served, new evidence and current character. However, the severity, intentionality, and systematic concealment actions mean that this case cannot be viewed as a spontaneous act of a juvenile. Therefore, the life sentence without parole is upheld." When the wooden gavel struck, the sound echoed in the large room, ending all disputes. Caleb only nodded slightly, expressionless. Carol, now elderly, cried silently. Outside the court, light snow fell, and reporters wrote another new line for the story that was thought to have closed 20 years ago. On the same day, Kessler submitted the summary report of the 20-year case-solving process, a document the Alaska Department of Law would use as a research file. In it he wrote the final line, "From the first sign, the smell of deodorant in the small room, to the resentencing hearing after 2 decades, every clue reminds us that justice may be slow, but it is not lost. Time can fade bloodstains, but it cannot erase responsibility." As he left the court, the snow began to fall heavier. Thick flakes covered the old steps of the building, where 20 years ago he had stood in his uniform, reading the arrest warrant for the 14-year-old boy. Now snow fell again, covering everything, but beneath the white layer, the truth remained intact, cold and unforgettable. When the Caleb Norwood case officially closed after the 2023 resentencing hearing, the town of Wasilla still could not return to its former state. 20 years had passed, but the name the Norwood house was still mentioned in whispers, as if merely speaking it would thicken the surrounding air. The residents here were once proud of the tranquility of their small suburb nestled between pine forests and lakes, where everyone knew each other's names. But since the 2003 case, that feeling was lost forever. On Maple Drive, where the nightmare was centered, the Grant family's house is now empty. After the 2 children, Ellie and Sadie, were found, their parents, Mark and Dana Grant, tried to live in Wasilla for a few more years, but every winter, when snow covered the backyard and wind whistled through the fence, the memory of their 2 daughters' laughter returned. In 2008 they sold the house, moved to Anchorage, and later left the state. The house was bought by another family, repainted, renovated, but the locals still refer to it as the house of the missing children. As for the Norwood house where the crime occurred, it no longer exists. It was demolished in 2005, but no one wants to build on the empty plot of land. Despite the city listing it for sale multiple times, all transactions failed. In the winter, when snow falls heavily, the plot becomes a cold white expanse between the small row of houses, with no sign of life. Locals sometimes say they can still smell the faint scent of deodorant when the wind blows through, a nameless haunting that has become a town legend. After the case, the high school Caleb attended organized many psychological counseling sessions for students and parents. But regardless, the shadow of the incident still looms. Former friends who played with Caleb said they could not believe a shy, polite boy could commit such a horrific act. A teacher said in a 2024 special report, "I taught Caleb for 2 years. He was quiet, diligent, always cleaned his desk after class. No one expected such darkness to exist within him." Trust among residents was fractured. After the tragedy, every time a child came home late, parents became panicked. They built higher fences, installed cameras, locked gates, and taught their children not to talk to anyone, even neighbors. Wasilla was no longer the place where everyone trusted everyone, as before. The crime of one child changed the entire psyche of a community. Years later, when Alaska State Troopers trainees study this case in the Cold Case in Arctic Conditions program, they are required not only to consider the forensic aspect, but also to study the social impact. Lieutenant Aaron Kessler's report, written after his retirement, is quoted in the training material. What made the Norwood case terrifying was not just the act of murder, but the silence surrounding it. For 6 months that house had its lights on, smoke still billowed from the chimney, and no one in the neighborhood dared to suspect anything unusual. Silence, whether born of trust or fear, can allow crime to exist longer than it should. Many local residents admitted that, during the months of the 2003 search, they had noticed something odd, the scent overpowering the cold air, the sight of Caleb burning incense in the room, or his mother opening the windows for no clear reason on cold evenings. But no one said anything, because no one wanted to believe the worst. 20 years have passed, and the town has changed. New houses have sprung up, New children have been born, and most people living here now only hear about the case through their parents' story. But every winter when the snow begins to fall and cover all of Maple Drive, there are still people who stop at the old empty plot, placing a small bouquet of flowers and 2 white candles, one for Ellie, one for Sadie. At the 20th anniversary memorial service, a reporter asked Kessler, now nearly 70, what he still thought about the case. He gazed into the distance through the melting snow, then said slowly, "I once thought justice was when the guilty were punished. But after many years, I realized that true justice is when the community dares to confront what made them silent. Only then can we escape the shadow of the crime." That quote was printed on a small plaque placed in front of the empty plot where the Norwood house once stood, and right below that line, they engraved a final sentence that has become the symbol of the case. Quoted from Kessler's final summary: "Snow can conceal traces, but the truth is never buried." When reading the last part of the report, Kessler paused for a long time at Dr. Gardner's handwritten note. The extent of the injuries and the arrangement of the bodies suggest the action was not entirely spontaneous, but rather calculated, even if the incident began as an accident. He placed the report on the desk, looking up at the photograph of the 2 children he had kept in the missing persons file, their bright smiles in the sun, their innocent eyes now only existing in a forensic report. He knew his next task: to transfer the entire file to the Alaska State Prosecutor's Office to prepare for criminal indictment. That afternoon, Kessler's car drove out of Wasilla, heading toward Anchorage. On the passenger seat was the thick file, the cover printed with a bold line, "Case UP Jaded, Double Homicide, State of Alaska vs. Caleb Norwood." He did not look back. Everything was now out of the hands of the investigating police. The truth was known, and the rest would belong to the court. But in his mind, the artificial scent of deodorant still lingered, the cloyingly sweet smell that covered death, and also the smell of unforgivable guilt. Monday morning, the Wasilla sky was covered with a thin layer of fog. Mat-Su Valley High School was quiet as usual, the murmur of student conversations echoing down the hallway. None of them knew that the school day would be interrupted by an event that would shake the entire town. Lieutenant Aaron Kessler, along with 2 officers from Anchorage, quietly parked outside the school gates. In the car he reopened the file. The DNA report, fingerprints, autopsy report, all pointed to the same person. The line on the last page from the Alaska State Prosecutor was printed in bold: "Arrest warrant, Caleb Norwood, 14 years old, first-degree murder suspect." Kessler read it one more time to ensure every detail was valid. Arresting a minor was never easy, especially when he was a student in a small, familiar community. He instructed his team: no commotion, no handcuffs in front of students, no public disclosure of identity until the legal process was completed. The 3 officers entered the main building and presented the warrant to the principal. The middle-aged man froze, his face turning pale when he heard the student's name mentioned in the warrant. Just a few minutes later, an administrative staff member escorted Caleb from the classroom to the office. He wore a gray sweater, jeans, and carried a backpack, looking no different from any other teenager. When he saw the police, Caleb paused briefly, his eyes wide, then looked around as if waiting for someone to explain what was happening. Kessler stood up, his voice calm but firm. "Caleb Norwood, you are under arrest by order of the Alaska State Court, in connection with the murder of Ellie and Sadie Grant. You have the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney." The atmosphere in the room was heavy. Caleb stood still, not saying a word. His hands were clasped together, fingers clenched until they were white. Kessler gently placed a hand on his shoulder, signaling the other officer to take the backpack. To avoid drawing attention, they escorted him through the back door, where the police car was waiting. Some students in the yard watched, their faces surprised, not understanding what was happening. On the way to Anchorage, Kessler sat in the front seat, his eyes looking straight through the windshield. In the back, Caleb was silent, his face turned toward the window, the morning light reflecting off his pale skin. There were no tears, no defense, just the heavy silence of someone who knew that all secrets had come to an end. At the Alaska State Troopers headquarters in Anchorage, Caleb was taken to a special interrogation room for minors. Carol Norwood was present as his guardian, her face haggard, eyes red and swollen. Next to her was the court-appointed lawyer, John Mercer, who specialized in defending minors in serious criminal cases. Kessler reread the suspect's full legal rights, then deferred to the Alaska State Prosecutor, David Holbrook, who had personally signed the arrest warrant. Holbrook briefly presented the charges, based on the results of the forensic examination, fingerprints, DNA and evidence collected at the scene. The state of Alaska is indicting Caleb Norwood with 2 counts of first-degree murder, under Title 11. Lawyer Mercer requested his client not to answer until the full file had been consulted. Caleb maintained his posture, eyes downcast at the table, hands clasped. When asked if he understood his rights, he nodded very slightly. Carol could not hold back, bursting into tears, while Kessler just looked down at the file in front of him, avoiding the mother's gaze. After the interrogation, Caleb was transferred to the Anchorage Juvenile Detention Center, a high-security facility but unlike a conventional prison. He was kept completely isolated, with no access to the press or outsiders. The indictment was sent to the Alaska State Supreme Court that same day. On Kessler's desk in Wasilla, the copy of the indictment read in a cold line, State of Alaska, Caleb Norwood, 2 counts of first-degree murder. He read the line over and over, then gently closed the file. 6 months ago, this was an unsolved missing person case. Now 2 children had been found, and the perpetrator, just a 14-year-old boy, was awaiting trial for an unimaginable crime. Outside, the snow was slowly melting, the damp ground reflecting the pale yellow lights of the small town. No one said it aloud, but all of Wasilla knew, the peace of this place would never return to what it once was.